So a very warm welcome to you, and we're going to start with this. South Africa's election date has been set for the 8th of May, and this means the rush to the polls is on, not just for political parties campaigning for votes, but also for the news media in trying to bring viewers relevant information. But how are we doing as local news organisations in covering all political parties fairly and without bias? It's an important question. William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa is here to weigh in. That organisation has been monitoring the coverage of every election period, I think I'm right in saying, since the first democratic elections in 1994. You've been at this a long time. You should know a thing or two.
Yeah, we have rather, and now this has become your rather large headache as well in terms of how you're going to cover elections.
Yes, thanks for that, William. So let's start with the rules, if we can, the rules of engagement. Are there different rules for commercial media as opposed to the public broadcaster?
So yes and no. So you all will be have to adhere to the rules that ICASA puts out on issues. So once the election period is declared, then those rules kick in, and that means that impacts what adverts you put on, how you spread those adverts. It's to really make sure that no broadcast is used or abused by any particular political party, or that you don't isolate any particular political party. So those rules apply across the board. And then, of course, you've got your editorial policies, but the mandate, say, of a channel like ENCA or OpenView is very different to that of the public broadcaster. They've got to make sure that they carry a lot more voter education programming, that kind of thing. And they've also got bigger means to try and make sure that they do offer more equitable coverage. But it's a big headache for all parties, because you've got to find that balance between what's newsworthy and also making sure that you provide equitable coverage to political parties.
And I'm glad you used the word equitable, because there's a difference between equitable coverage and equal coverage.
So if you look at the results of media coverage, you'll find that, and this is going across about 104 different media, you'll find that the coverage tends to look where you've got ANC comes first, then the DA, then the EFF, and then your other parties. So you've got about 5 parties that make up about 75 or 76% of all of the coverage of political parties. And obviously there were 30 parties that registered. So you can see that if you're a small party, you've really got very little chance of getting much news coverage. And if you're one of the big ones, you will. But that shape of that is broadly speaking in line with party representation in Parliament, which I don't think is necessarily intentional, but certainly if you look at the EFF, they get a lot more coverage than their representation in Parliament.
All right, so typically, William Bird, where do we make mistakes in our coverage? What do we need to look out for?
It's kind of one of the best things, and also probably one of the things that causes us that problem, which is that South African media have, since our democracy, been overwhelmingly fair. It's like this is our extreme backlash to our awful, brutal history, where we've said we're going to make every effort to make sure that we're fair. And sure, you'll find examples where there are bad things that happen, and they do, but broadly speaking, our media need to be commended for being overwhelmingly fair. The problem with that, of course, is that what a lot of our media coverage around elections has tended to become is quite dry and quite boring, where we tend to mostly focus on what the politicians are saying, which means that we're allowing them to determine the narrative and not the other way around. It should be media that are saying, these are our elections. This is about the needs of the public, not the interests of the political parties. And yet we tend to find that they will determine and shape that narrative. And
so how do we guard against that then as the media? What do we do?
Well, I think that we need to be going out as media entities and saying, we're in this for the public interest. And you start with a question, what do the public need to know? What don't they know? And how do we make sure that they know that information?
In fact, you refer to this as people-centred coverage, don't you? And that was a prominent aspect of the report that you put together after the 2016 election. So articulate that for me. What is people-centred coverage?
So it means elections aren't about the political parties, and yet we tend to make them about the leaders and their infighting. And yet, actually, they're not about that. This is about electing a group who are going to follow
political leaders
parties.
And infighting also makes for good headlines,
No,
doesn't
it does.
Yeah.
It does make for good headlines. But again, you know, we all expect that. A lot of the things that they do, you know, all of them are going to promise us that they're going to solve all of our problems, and yet frequently and overwhelmingly they don't, ever, right? Around the world, not just our party. So we've got to say, well, what is it that we need to start offering election coverage on that's actually going to give voters something different to think about and something different to chew on that maybe might shift their way that they think about who they're going to vote for. So we don't talk about the critical issues that are really hard for political parties, like gender-based violence. Of course, it's easy for them to say, oh, yes, that's very bad, we care a lot, blah, 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 nonsense, right?
Or issues like the environment, for instance, which wasn't referred to at all by President Ramaphosa in the State of the Nation address, much to everyone's surprise.
It's extraordinary, and that we've got so many of our cities and towns on the brink of natural disasters through drought and other causes, and yet those things don't seem to feature.
Is there a correlation, I wonder, when all is said and done, between the coverage we give either the parties or the leaders and the result?
So it tends to be fairly similar, actually, you know, and again, it's because you've got to find that balance between equitable coverage. So what's really interesting, and this is why I say that we tend to allow the politicians and political parties to determine the narrative rather than the other way around, is that shape tends to look quite similar across different media, whether they're community media, whether they're public service media, whether they're commercial media, print, online only, mix of broadcast, radio, whatever it is. That graph tends to look pretty damn similar, which I think is a problem for us. You know, you need to be getting different emphases if you are consuming different media.
You've raised the issue of equitable coverage, but what about media coverage matching, for instance, gender or population spread within a country? How important is that?
So again, 52% of our population are women, yet you'll find that less than or around 22% of all the people that speak are female politicians. So, you know, why do we always expect women to listen to men? And similarly, how do we start to cover issues that actually are deeply undermining our democracy?
So how do we get that right in the media then?
I think that you then say
we've just got to look harder, haven't we?
But also to say we've got a deliberate agenda where we're going to be focusing political parties and asking them consistently, what are your plans around gender-based violence? Not just is it bad, what are your plans around climate change? What are you practically going to do? And if you're an opposition party, what strategies are you going to employ to make sure that you hold government to account to actually do something about climate change? Can you give us 5 things that you've done over the last 5 years? You know, these and these ministers, what do they have at home? So you can personalize it and make it interesting. But I think that we've got to start off by saying we've got a citizens' agenda here, which is things that are going to make South Africa better and meet our democracy, not what are the politicians going to tell us what they want to say when they go and speak at a big political rally.
And inevitably, and this is a final question, what we tend to do is we focus our coverage on the areas that are most populated.
Yeah.
So particularly as far as this channel is concerned, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape, but that is not to say that there are not important issues emerging, for instance, in smaller provinces like the Northern Cape or the Northwest.
Yes, certainly. And I mean, of course, you do expect the coverage to be there. That's where the politicians focus. It's where the media tend to be focused. But again, you know, we've got so many of our towns and cities on the verge of disaster in the Eastern Cape. We know it seems to be the forgotten province, and yet there's so many issues there that could really be stimulating thoughts about climate change, about all of these big issues, and yet we don't give those things anywhere near enough.
Not defending our position, though, but it does come down to resource and capacity, as it does in all newsrooms around the world, doesn't it?
Exactly, but where you do have power and capacity is to set that agenda with the limited resources that you have to say, right, these are the issues, be open and clear about it, let people know. We're going to focus on these things, the economy, climate change, gender-based violence, children's rights, and whatever other issue, land, inequality, poverty, whatever it is. There's so many. It's like pick a hot topic issue and you can do it, and you can make all of those really interesting. Crime, it's one of our perennial issues. Load shedding, what are we doing about power and alternative energy? Come on, it's like that affects everyone, and yet we tend to allow those politicians to say, this is what we're going to tell you we want you to cover, and then they'll moan like stuck pigs when they don't get that coverage.
Well, speaking of that, let's finish this interview before the lights go out. We look forward, William Bird, to you looming over our right and left shoulders, monitoring the way in which we cover election 2019. William Bird, Director, Media Monitoring Africa, thank you very much indeed. We'd like to get your thoughts on how news organizations are doing in covering the national election. On this channel, our coverage has already started. You can get in touch with us on our various social media platforms. Next on the program, making a better world through creativity. What to expect from design